Edward Carrington stood outside the flat, his polished leather shoes tapping impatiently on the cracked pavement. The gray London sky mirrored his mood, a mix of irritation and indifference. Behind him, a junior associate from his real estate firm shuffled nervously, clutching a clipboard and a stack of eviction notices. "This shouldn't take long," Edward muttered, his tone clipped. "She's just another tenant who can't manage her affairs." The associate nodded mutely as Edward rapped sharply on the door of flat 15C. The building was old, its bricks weathered by decades of grime and neglect. Edward's properties weren't meant to be luxurious. They were investments, cold and calculated. The door opened to reveal Eleanor Whitaker, a petite woman with silver-streaked hair and kind but weary eyes. She looked at Edward with a mixture of resignation and quiet strength. "Mr. Carrington," she said softly. "I assume this isn't a social visit?" Edward crossed his arms, ignoring the tremor in her voice. "Mrs. Whitaker, you're 3 weeks overdue on your rent. We've sent notices and yet here we are." Eleanor's grip on the doorframe tightened. "I've lived here for 15 years. This is the first payment I've ever missed. If you'd give me just a little more time." Edward cut her off, his voice cold. "A missed payment is a breach of contract. My policies are clear, Mrs. Whitaker. I run a business, not a charity." Eleanor's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground. "You run a business, yes. But businesses are run by people. Surely you can see this isn't just about money, it's about decency." Edward's lips thinned into a hard line. "I'm not here to debate morality. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises." Eleanor's shoulders sagged, but her eyes remained steady. "Very well," she said, her voice calm but edged with sorrow. "But I hope you never find yourself in a position where you're shown as little kindness as you've shown me today." Her words stung, though Edward didn't let it show. He turned on his heel and walked away, his associate trailing behind. Eleanor watched them leave, the weight of her impending homelessness pressing down like a physical burden. Inside, the flat was quiet, its walls filled with the echoes of a life she had painstakingly built. Now it would all be taken from her. Later that evening, Edward sat in his sleek penthouse overlooking the Thames, a glass of whiskey in hand. The eviction was just another tick on his ledger, a problem solved. Yet Eleanor's parting words lingered in his mind, unwelcome and unsettling. He brushed them aside, focusing instead on the next deal in his ever-growing portfolio. Success, he believed, was built on discipline and detachment. Emotions were a weakness he had long since learned to suppress. But as he stared out at the glittering city lights, Edward couldn't shake the faint unease creeping into his chest. Eleanor's dignity in the face of hardship was unlike anything he had encountered in his cutthroat world. For a moment he wondered if he had made a mistake. Then, as always, he dismissed the thought. The next day, Eleanor packed her belongings with care, her movements slow but deliberate. Every item told a story: a photograph of a child with curly hair and a gap-toothed smile, a frayed quilt sewn by her late mother, a chipped teacup she had used every morning for over a decade. She placed each object into boxes as if saying goodbye to an old friend. Her neighbor, an elderly man named Arthur, knocked on her door to offer his help. "You don't deserve this, Eleanor," he said, his voice heavy with anger. "Carrington's a heartless man." Eleanor gave him a sad smile. "Maybe he is. Or maybe he's just forgotten how to see people for who they really are." Arthur shook his head. "I hope he remembers someday. For his sake." As Eleanor closed the door of her flat for the final time, she looked back one last time. The space that had been her home now felt cold and empty, stripped of the warmth she had poured into it over the years. With a deep breath, she walked away, determined to face whatever came next with the same quiet strength she had always shown. Meanwhile, Edward returned to the flat later that evening to inspect the property. His associate had mentioned finding some old junk left behind, and Edward wanted to ensure it was cleared. Inside, the flat felt different, emptier, yet not entirely void of life. As he moved through the small rooms, he noticed a box tucked into a corner, overlooked in the hasty cleanup. Curiosity got the better of him and he opened it. Inside were items that told a story: a faded photograph of a young boy, a bundle of letters tied with string, and a small hand-knitted sweater. Edward picked up the photograph, his eyes narrowing as he studied the boy's face. Something about it felt eerily familiar, though he couldn't place why. He flipped over the photograph and read the faint handwriting on the back: "To my dearest Jacob, always in my heart. Love, Mom." A strange sensation gripped Edward, an unsettling mix of confusion and recognition. The name Jacob sparked a memory buried deep within him, one he had spent a lifetime avoiding. As he stood in the dimly lit flat, holding the photograph, A single thought began to take shape, a thought that would soon unravel everything he thought he knew about himself. Eleanor Whitaker sat on the edge of the lumpy cot in the small room provided by a local shelter. The stark walls were a far cry from the warmth of the home she had left behind, but Eleanor wasn't one to dwell on what she had lost. Life had taught her the futility of self-pity. She opened the worn diary she carried everywhere, the pages filled with a mix of sorrow and hope, and began to write. Eleanor's story began in the industrial town of Manchester in the late 1970s. She had been a young mother working long shifts in a textile factory to support her son, Jacob. He was her joy, her purpose, and the source of every ounce of strength she possessed. But life hadn't been kind. Jacob's father had disappeared when Eleanor was pregnant, leaving her to fend for herself in a world that had little sympathy for single mothers. She worked tirelessly, often skipping meals to ensure Jacob had enough to eat. Still, the bills piled up, and the future grew more uncertain with each passing day. One particularly harsh winter, Eleanor made the most difficult decision of her life. Jacob had been ill for weeks, his cheeks pale and his little body frail. The doctor's visits and medicine were far beyond Eleanor's means, and her desperation reached a breaking point. "I can't take care of him properly," she had sobbed to her older sister Margaret, who had driven her to the adoption agency in London. "I don't want him to suffer because of me." Margaret had tried to comfort her, but the decision weighed heavy on them both. When the social worker took Jacob's small hand and led him away, Eleanor had clutched her chest, feeling as though her heart had been ripped from her body. She watched as her son turned to look at her one last time, his wide eyes filled with confusion. "I love you, Jacob," she had whispered, her tears falling freely. "I'll find you again one day, I promise." Decades had passed since that cold morning, but the memory remained vivid. Eleanor had spent the following years moving from job to job, always trying to build a life stable enough to search for Jacob. Letters sent to the agency went unanswered, and the trail grew cold. Yet she never gave up hope. Every birthday, she would light a candle and whisper a prayer that her son was safe and happy. Her flat in London had been her sanctuary, the only place where she felt close to him. The photograph of Jacob that Edward had found was her most treasured possession, along with the small sweater she had knitted for him when he was a toddler. She had kept them all these years, reminders of the love that had never faded. As Eleanor sat in the shelter, she thought about her encounter with Edward Carrington. His cold demeanor and refusal to show compassion had stung, but she couldn't bring herself to hate him. People became cruel for a reason, she believed, and perhaps Edward's cruelty was rooted in his own pain. She closed her diary and looked at the photograph of Jacob. "I'll find you," she murmured. "I don't care how long it takes." Meanwhile, Edward sat in his office, the photograph of Jacob resting on his desk. He had spent the afternoon staring at it, unable to focus on his work. The name Jacob triggered something deep within him, a distant memory he couldn't quite grasp. Feeling restless, Edward called his assistant, asking her to gather information about Eleanor Whitaker. He told himself it was for professional reasons, a way to ensure his properties were left in order. But deep down he knew it was more than that. He needed answers. The assistant returned with a small folder containing public records. As Edward flipped through the pages, he discovered fragments of Eleanor's life, her long history at the flat, her work at a local charity shop, and a series of letters she had written to adoption agencies over the years. One letter in particular caught his attention. It was dated over 30 years ago and addressed to an agency in Manchester. The words were faded but legible. "To whom it may concern. I am writing to inquire about my son Jacob. He was placed for adoption in 1980. Please, if there is any way to let him know that I love him and think of him every day." Edward's heart pounded as he read the letter. The pieces began to fall into place, each one more startling than the last. The dates, the name Jacob, the photograph, it all pointed to one unimaginable truth. Eleanor wasn't just another tenant. She was his mother. Edward sat back in his chair, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. A surge of emotions, anger, confusion, and a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, coursed through him. The woman he had evicted without a second thought was the same woman who had given him life. But instead of feeling relief or connection, Edward's thoughts turned bitter. "She abandoned me," he muttered to himself, the photograph crumpling in his grip. "Why would I owe her anything now?" Even as he spoke the words, a part of him knew they weren't entirely true. Eleanor's letters painted a picture of a woman who had sacrificed everything for her child. But Edward wasn't ready to confront those feelings. Not yet. As the night deepened, Eleanor prepared to leave the shelter the next morning. She had heard of a temporary housing program that might offer her a room while she looked for work. Her journey was far from over, but she carried with her the same hope that had sustained her for decades. And somewhere across the city, Edward stared out at the London skyline, the photograph of his younger self still clutched in his hand. Their lives, so different yet so intertwined, were on the brink of colliding in ways neither of them could have imagined. Edward Carrington stood in his lavish office, its sleek design a testament to his success. The morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting off polished surfaces and illuminating his collection of framed achievements, certificates, awards and photographs with prominent figures. Yet today none of it brought him the usual satisfaction. His mind was preoccupied, the photograph of a boy named Jacob tucked into his desk drawer like a haunting secret. Edward wasn't always this way. Once, he had been a curious, bright-eyed child with an insatiable appetite for adventure. Adopted at the age of 4 by a loving couple in Kent, he had experienced a childhood that, for all intents and purposes, should have been idyllic. His parents, Sarah and Philip Carrington, were kind and supportive, offering him every opportunity a child could hope for. But Edward's idyllic world began to crumble when he was 12. Philip was diagnosed with a rare illness and within a year he was gone. The loss shattered the family and Sarah struggled to keep things together. Though she worked tirelessly, their financial situation deteriorated, and Edward began to feel the cracks in the life they had built. By the time Edward entered university, his mother's health had begun to fail as well. She passed away during his second year, leaving him orphaned once again. Grief hardened him, turning his once warm and inquisitive nature into a steely resolve to never be vulnerable again. "I learned early on," Edward often said to colleagues, "that the world doesn't hand you success. You take it or you're left behind." As he reviewed his morning schedule, Edward's assistant, Laura, entered with a stack of files. "Mr. Carrington, your 10 o'clock meeting has been rescheduled. Also, the information you requested on Eleanor Whitaker. There's more?" Edward nodded, motioning for her to leave the files on his desk. Once alone, he opened the folder, scanning its contents. His eyes lingered on another letter Eleanor had written to the adoption agency, pleading for information about Jacob. The words struck a chord, though Edward immediately buried the feeling. "She gave me away," he muttered to himself, the bitterness rising again. "And now I'm supposed to feel what? Gratitude?" Later that day, Edward attended a meeting with his senior staff. The topic was another acquisition, a block of flats in East London that promised lucrative returns. Edward led the discussion with his usual precision, dissecting risks and opportunities with an analytical mind. But beneath his composed exterior, his thoughts drifted. When one of his colleagues suggested raising rents to maximize profit, Edward nodded absent-mindedly. It was a strategy he had employed many times before, often displacing long-term tenants in favor of wealthier ones. It was just business, he reminded himself. But for the first time he questioned the justification. His encounter with Eleanor had planted a seed of doubt, though he wasn't ready to admit it. As the meeting concluded, Edward caught himself staring at the empty seat across the table, imagining Eleanor sitting there, her steady gaze challenging his every word. That evening, Edward returned to his penthouse, a fortress of glass and steel high above the city. He poured himself a drink and sat by the window, the lights of London sprawling before him. The photograph of Jacob was back in his hand, the image of the boy stirring memories he had long buried. He thought about Sarah and Philip, the love and security they had given him. For years, he had blamed his biological mother for abandoning him, telling himself that she had simply discarded him like an inconvenience. It was easier than confronting the possibility that she might have loved him, that her decision might have been one of sacrifice rather than selfishness. Edward clenched his fist, the photograph crumpling slightly. "Why now?" he asked aloud, his voice echoing in the empty room. Why did she have to show up now? Across the city, Eleanor sat in the temporary housing program's communal lounge, sipping a cup of tea. The accommodations were modest but clean, and the staff had been kind. Still, Eleanor felt a pang of sadness as she thought of her old flat, the home she had nurtured for so many years. She opened her diary and began to write, her thoughts flowing onto the page like a quiet confession. "Jacob, my dear boy, I don't know where you are or if you'll ever forgive me. But I hope you're happy wherever life has taken you. If only I could tell you how much I've missed you, how much I've loved you every single day." Tears blurred the ink as Eleanor closed the diary, her heart heavy. She had no idea that the son she longed for was the very man who had turned her world upside down. Edward spent the rest of the evening going through old memories, searching for clarity. He retrieved a box of keepsakes from his childhood, hidden in the back of a closet. Among the items was a small wooden toy train, one of the few possessions he had brought with him when he was adopted. He turned it over in his hands, a faint inscription catching his eye, "To Jacob, my sunshine. Love, Mom." Edward froze, the words striking him like a bolt of lightning. He stared at the toy, the image of Eleanor's face flashing in his mind. For the first time, he began to consider the possibility that her story wasn't as simple as he had always believed. But the walls he had built around his heart were strong, and his anger wasn't easily subdued. As he placed the toy back into the box, he whispered to himself, "She has no right to expect anything from me." Yet deep down, Edward knew the truth. The only way to silence the questions haunting him was to confront Eleanor, and the answers she carried. Edward Carrington stood outside the temporary housing facility, the hum of London traffic behind him. The address had come from his assistant, Laura, who had diligently tracked Eleanor Whitaker's whereabouts. Edward hadn't told her why he wanted the information, brushing it off as a business necessity. But now, as he stared at the worn brick facade of the shelter, he knew this was personal. He adjusted his tailored coat and stepped inside. The receptionist, a young woman with a kind face, greeted him with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Eleanor Whitaker," Edward said, his voice firm but lacking its usual cold edge. The receptionist hesitated. "Are you family?" Edward paused. The word family hung heavy in the air. "No," he replied after a moment. "But I need to speak with her." "It's urgent?" The receptionist nodded reluctantly and disappeared down the hall. Edward waited, his hands in his pockets, his mind racing. He didn't know what he would say to Eleanor, or even what he wanted from her. All he knew was that the questions gnawing at him couldn't be ignored any longer. Eleanor entered the reception area, her steps slow but steady. She wore a simple cardigan over a floral dress, her silver hair pulled back neatly. When her eyes met Edward's, she froze. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by a mix of surprise and apprehension. "Mr. Carrington," she said, her tone cautious. "What are you doing here?" Edward gestured to a nearby seating area. "We need to talk." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. She led him to a quiet corner of the lounge where they sat across from each other. Edward took a deep breath, his carefully constructed facade slipping. "I found this," he began, pulling the crumpled photograph from his coat pocket. He placed it on the table between them, his eyes locked on hers. "It was in your flat." Eleanor's breath hitched. She picked up the photograph, her hands trembling as she smoothed it out. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "Jacob?" Edward leaned forward, his voice low and taut. "Is that my name? Was that my name?" Eleanor looked up at him, her face etched with pain and regret. "Yes," she said softly. "Jacob was the name I gave you when you were born." Edward's heart pounded. Hearing her confirm it made everything feel real, too real. He struggled to keep his composure as a flood of emotions surged within him. "You're my mother," he said, the words heavy and strange in his mouth. Eleanor nodded, her tears spilling over. "I am. And I have missed you every single day of my life." Edward sat back, his expression hardening. "You missed me? You gave me away." Eleanor flinched at his words, but she didn't look away. "I didn't want to," she said, her voice trembling. "You have to understand, I had no choice. I was young, alone, and struggling to keep you fed. You were so small, so fragile. I couldn't bear to watch you suffer." Edward's jaw tightened. "So you abandoned me?" Eleanor shook her head vehemently. "No. I made the hardest decision of my life because I loved you. I wanted you to have a chance at a better life, one that I couldn't give you. And you think that excuses it?" Edward's voice rose, drawing a few glances from across the room. He lowered it again, his tone cutting. "You think that makes it okay?" Eleanor's tears flowed freely now, but she held her ground. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Edward. But please, believe me when I say that I never stopped loving you." Edward stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He couldn't bear to sit there any longer, the weight of her words suffocating him. "I don't know what you want from me," he said coldly. "But I don't owe you anything." Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes filled with anguish. "I don't want anything from you," she said softly. "I just wanted to know that you were safe, that you were happy. And now that I know, I can live with that." Edward turned and walked away, the photograph still clutched in Eleanor's hand. His mind raced as he exited the building, the city's noise swallowing him. He had come seeking answers and he had found them, but they only left him with more questions. That night, Edward sat alone in his penthouse, the city lights sprawling out below him. His emotions swung wildly between anger and confusion, resentment and a strange aching sadness. He thought of Eleanor's tears, her words, and the look in her eyes when she said she loved him. For years, Edward had built his life on the foundation of self-reliance, telling himself he needed no one. But now that foundation felt unsteady, as if the very ground beneath him were shifting. He reached for the photograph on his desk, the same one Eleanor had returned to him as he left. He stared at his younger self, at the boy he barely remembered, and at the words scrawled on the back, Jacob. Edward whispered the name to himself, the sound foreign yet oddly familiar. For the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. The next morning, Edward Carrington sat in his office, the photograph of Jacob tucked neatly into his desk drawer. He had buried himself in work, scheduling back-to-back meetings to drown out the whirlwind of emotions churning inside him. Yet no matter how hard he tried, the words Eleanor had spoken haunted him. "I never stopped loving you." Edward closed his laptop with an irritated sigh. The truth of Eleanor's words had pierced through his defenses, and the anger he had clung to felt less like strength and more like avoidance. He needed answers, more answers than he had allowed himself to hear the day before. Without overthinking it, Edward left his office and headed back to the shelter. He walked with purpose, his footsteps echoing in the chilly London streets. This time he didn't need a receptionist to guide him. He spotted Eleanor sitting in the small garden behind the building, her diary in her lap. She looked up as he approached, her expression a mix of surprise and caution. "Mr. Carrington," she greeted, rising to her feet. "Eleanor," he replied, his voice clipped. "We're not finished?" She nodded, motioning toward a bench beneath a sprawling tree. "Please sit." Edward hesitated but eventually complied, folding his arms as he leaned back. "I don't understand you," he said, his tone accusatory. "You gave me away, yet you act like I'm supposed to feel grateful." Eleanor's shoulders sagged slightly, but her gaze remained steady. "I don't expect gratitude, Edward. I know my decision hurt you, and I'll carry that guilt for the rest of my life. But I didn't give you away because I didn't love you. I did it because I loved you too much to see you suffer." Edward scoffed. A convenient justification. Eleanor leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly together. "Do you think it was easy for me? Do you think I didn't lie awake every night wondering if you were safe? If you were happy? I have lived with the weight of that choice for 35 years, Edward. I wouldn't wish that pain on anyone." Her words were raw, and Edward found himself momentarily at a loss. He had spent so long believing that his biological mother had simply discarded him, and now he was being confronted with a truth far more complicated than he had imagined. "You could have found me sooner," he said quietly, his anger giving way to a faint tremor of vulnerability. "Why wait until now?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I tried, Edward. I wrote letters, made phone calls, begged agencies for information. But the records were sealed and no one would tell me anything. By the time I found a lead, you were grown and I was afraid you'd hate me." Edward's jaw tightened. "And you were right." Eleanor flinched but nodded. "I deserve that." Silence settled between them, heavy and fraught. Edward's mind raced as he tried to reconcile the woman before him with the narrative he had clung to for so long. She was not the cold, unfeeling figure he had imagined. She was flawed, broken, and painfully human. "I don't know what you expect me to do," Edward said finally, his voice subdued. Eleanor wiped her eyes and looked at him with quiet determination. "I don't expect anything, Edward. I just wanted you to know the truth. What you do with it is up to you." Edward stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. For years he had told himself he didn't need answers, that the past was irrelevant. But now that the answers were here, he realized how much he had needed them all along. Later that evening, Edward returned to his penthouse. He poured himself a drink and stood by the window, gazing out at the glittering cityscape. Eleanor's words replayed in his mind, intertwining with memories of his adoptive parents and the life they had given him. He thought of Sarah and Philip, of their unwavering love and the sacrifices they had made to give him a home. He thought of Eleanor, of the sacrifices she had made to give him a chance at a life she couldn't provide. For the first time he saw the parallels between them, and it left him feeling both humbled and conflicted. Edward picked up the photograph of Jacob from his desk. He stared at the boy's innocent smile and whispered, "What am I supposed to do now?" Across the city, Eleanor sat alone in her room at the shelter, her diary open in her lap. She wrote in delicate, looping script, her thoughts spilling onto the page. "Today I told him the truth. I don't know if he'll ever forgive me, but I can live with that. At least he knows how much I've loved him even from afar. I pray that one day he'll find it in his heart to let me in. But if he doesn't, I'll understand. I'll love him all the same." Eleanor closed the diary and placed it on her nightstand. She climbed into bed, her heart heavy yet hopeful. For the first time in decades, she felt as though a door had opened, a door she had thought would remain closed forever. Edward stayed awake late into the night, the photograph still in his hand. He thought about Eleanor's resilience, her willingness to face his anger with grace and honesty. And for the first time in years, Edward felt a crack in the armor he had built around himself. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He couldn't ignore Eleanor's presence in his life. Not anymore. Edward Carrington sat in the back of his car as it wove through London's congested streets. Rain pattered softly against the windows, mirroring the storm of emotions within him. He had spent the last few days wrestling with his feelings about Eleanor Whittaker, and no matter how much he tried, he couldn't shake her presence from his mind. His driver pulled up to a quiet cafe tucked into a corner of Camden. Edward had arranged this meeting himself, a rare step for someone who preferred to delegate all personal matters. As he stepped inside, he spotted Eleanor sitting near the window, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. She looked up as the bell above the door chimed, her expression cautiously hopeful. "Edward," she greeted as he approached. "I didn't expect to hear from you again so soon." Edward nodded curtly, taking the seat across from her. "I thought we should talk," he said, his tone measured. "Properly?" Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile. "I'd like that." For the first time, their conversation wasn't weighed down by accusations or defensiveness. Eleanor spoke openly about her life after giving Jacob up for adoption, her struggles, her regrets, and the small joys she had found along the way. "I never married," she said, her gaze distant. "I couldn't bring myself to start another family. Felt wrong, as though I were replacing you. So, I poured myself into my work and my community. It helped ease the pain, but it never filled the void." Edward listened silently, his usual sharp retorts muted by the sincerity in her voice. For years, he had imagined his biological mother as selfish and unfeeling, but the woman before him was neither of those things. She was flawed, yes, but also deeply human. When Eleanor asked about his own life, Edward hesitated. He was a man who rarely shared personal details, even with those closest to him. But something about Eleanor's vulnerability prompted him to open up. "I was adopted by a couple in Kent," he began. "Sarah and Philip Carrington. They were good people, kind, patient, everything a child could ask for. But they both died before I was 20. That's why I am the way I am, I suppose. I learned early on that you can't rely on anyone but yourself." Eleanor's eyes filled with sympathy. "I'm so sorry, Edward. Losing them must have been devastating." Edward shrugged, his expression guarded. "It was. But it also taught me how to survive. I've built everything I have on my own terms, and I don't let anyone get close enough to take it away." Eleanor reached across the table, her hand hovering near his but not quite touching. "You don't have to do everything alone, Edward. You're not alone anymore." Edward's jaw tightened, his instinct to recoil from her words battling with a flicker of longing he couldn't quite suppress. He said nothing, his silence speaking volumes. In the days that followed, Edward began making tentative efforts to bridge the gap between himself and Eleanor. He invited her to lunch at his office, introducing her to his assistant and carefully navigating their growing bond. Eleanor, for her part, approached each interaction with patience, never pushing Edward beyond what he was ready to share. But not everyone in Edward's life welcomed Eleanor's presence. During a meeting with his senior team, Edward's closest advisor, Paul, pulled him aside. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Paul asked, his tone cautious. "Bringing her into your life, I mean. She's a stranger, Edward. You don't know what she wants." Edward's eyes narrowed. "She's my mother." Paul raised his hands defensively. "I understand that, but think about the implications. What if she's after your money? Your reputation?" Edward's voice turned cold. "She doesn't want anything from me. And even if she did, it's none of your concern." Paul backed off, but his words lingered. They fed into Edward's insecurities, fueling the doubts he had been working so hard to silence. That evening, when Eleanor called to invite him to a community event she was volunteering for, Edward declined with an abruptness that surprised even himself. Eleanor stood outside the shelter, watching as families filed into the community center for the event. She had hoped Edward would come, but his curt rejection replayed in her mind like a sour note. Still, she refused to let it dampen her spirits. She had spent years hoping for a connection with her son, and while their progress was slow and uneven, she clung to the small steps they had taken. Inside, Eleanor found herself surrounded by laughter and warmth. Children painted pictures, parents chatted over cups of tea, and volunteers moved through the crowd with smiles on their faces. It reminded her of what she had always wanted for Jacob, a life filled with love and security. As the evening wound down, Eleanor sat alone at a table, her thoughts drifting to Edward. She wondered if she had asked too much of him, if her presence in his life was more a burden than a gift. But then she thought of his eyes when he spoke of his adoptive parents, the way his voice softened when he mentioned them. Beneath his cold exterior, there was a man who yearned for connection, even if he didn't know how to admit it. Meanwhile, Edward sat in his penthouse, staring at his phone. Eleanor's number was on the screen, his finger hovering over the call button. He wanted to apologize for his earlier abruptness, but the words felt foreign and heavy. Instead, he poured himself a drink and retreated to his study, where he retrieved the wooden train from his childhood. He ran his fingers over the inscription, "To Jacob, my sunshine. Love, Mom." For the first time, Edward allowed himself to feel the weight of those words. He thought of Eleanor's resilience, her quiet strength, and the love she had carried for him all these years. It wasn't the love he had known from Sarah and Philip, but it was no less real. Edward placed the train back on the shelf and picked up his phone again. This time he dialed. The call rang twice before Eleanor answered, her voice warm despite the late hour. "Edward?" He hesitated, then said, "I'm sorry for earlier. I shouldn't have dismissed you like that." Eleanor's silence was brief but filled with understanding. "Thank you, Edward. That means more than you know." Edward exhaled, the tension in his chest easing slightly. "Are you free for lunch tomorrow?" Eleanor's smile was audible through the phone. "I'd like that." As the call ended, Edward leaned back in his chair, a sense of unfamiliar relief washing over him. It wasn't forgiveness and it wasn't a resolution, but it was another step forward. The cafe buzzed with the quiet hum of conversation as Edward Carrington and Eleanor Whitaker sat across from each other at a corner table. Unlike their previous meetings, the atmosphere was lighter, the tension between them softened by time and effort. Eleanor sipped her tea, her eyes crinkling with a smile as she listened to Edward recount a rare childhood memory. "Philip used to make me laugh so hard I'd get hiccups," Edward said, a faint grin tugging at his lips. "He'd pretend the sofa was a pirate ship, and we'd sail through imaginary storms. Sarah would always scold him for encouraging my wild imagination." Eleanor's gaze lingered on him, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "They sound like wonderful parents," she said softly. "I'm so glad you had them." Edward nodded, but the mention of Sarah and Philip brought a shadow to his expression. They were. Losing them felt like losing everything. Eleanor reached across the table, her hand hovering near his. "I can't replace them, Edward. I wouldn't even try. But I hope you know I'm here for you now, for whatever that's worth." Edward's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, the guarded walls he had spent years building seemed to falter. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I appreciate that." The warmth of their conversation carried Edward through the afternoon, but the peace was short-lived. That evening, as he sat in his penthouse, his phone buzzed with an urgent message from Laura, his assistant. "Paul wants to meet ASAP. Claims it's about Eleanor." Edward frowned, irritation prickling at the edges of his mind. Paul had been growing increasingly vocal about his concerns regarding Eleanor, and Edward was in no mood for another lecture. Still, he agreed to meet. When Edward arrived at the office, Paul was waiting with a stack of papers and an air of smug self-righteousness. "Edward," he began, sliding the documents across the table. "I think you need to see this." Edward picked up the papers, his eyes narrowing as he scanned them. They were financial records, carefully arranged to suggest that Eleanor had been involved in some dubious dealings. A series of transactions linked her to a struggling community charity, one that had been flagged for financial mismanagement. "What exactly am I looking at?" Edward asked, his tone icy. Paul leaned forward, his expression triumphant. "Proof that Eleanor isn't who she says she is. She's been funneling money into a failing charity. If this goes public, it could damage your reputation and your business." Edward's jaw tightened. "You're suggesting she's using me?" "I'm saying you need to be careful," Paul said, his tone patronizing. "She's a liability, Edward. Cut ties before she drags you down." Edward slammed the papers onto the table, his anger barely contained. "You don't know her," he said sharply. "And you clearly don't understand me." Paul opened his mouth to respond, but Edward silenced him with a glare. "Leave Eleanor out of this. And if you ever question my judgment again, I'll find someone else to fill your role. Paul's face darkened, but he nodded reluctantly. Understood. As Edward left the office, his thoughts churned. He didn't believe Paul's accusations, but the insinuation planted a seed of doubt. He needed to confront Eleanor, not out of suspicion, but to hear the truth from her own lips. The next day, Edward met Eleanor at the community center where she volunteered. The space was bustling with activity, children painting, parents chatting, and volunteers moving with purpose. Eleanor greeted him with a warm smile, her face lighting up as she saw him. "Edward, I didn't expect you today. We need to talk," he said, his voice steady but serious. Eleanor's smile faltered, but she nodded. "Of course. Let's step outside." They walked to a small garden behind the center, the air crisp and filled with the faint scent of blooming flowers. Edward turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I need you to tell me about this," he said, holding out the financial records Paul had shown him. "What's your connection to this charity?" Eleanor's eyes widened as she scanned the papers. When she looked back at Edward, her expression was a mix of hurt and determination. "The charity is mine," she said simply. "I started it years ago, using what little money I had to help struggling families." Edward's brow furrowed. "But these records are incomplete," Eleanor interrupted. "Yes, we've faced financial challenges, but every penny has gone to helping others. I've been transparent with my donors, and I have nothing to hide." Edward studied her, his instincts telling him she was telling the truth. "Why didn't you tell me about this before?" Eleanor sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "Because I didn't want you to think I was trying to impress you or ask for help. This charity isn't about me, Edward. It's about the people who need it." Edward's anger dissipated, replaced by a deep sense of shame. He had allowed Paul's cynicism to cloud his judgment even briefly. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I shouldn't have doubted you." Eleanor placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle. "It's all right, Edward. Trust takes time." The confrontation became a turning point for Edward. That evening he made a decision that surprised even himself. He called Laura and instructed her to draft a donation to Eleanor's charity, large enough to cover its immediate needs. When Eleanor received the news, she called Edward, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "Thank you doesn't feel like enough." Edward smiled faintly, the first genuine smile he had felt in days. "You don't have to say anything, Eleanor. Just keep doing what you're doing." As they ended the call, Edward felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time he saw Eleanor not as a reminder of his past, but as a vital part of his future. And for the first time he allowed himself to believe that reconciliation was truly possible. The London sky was overcast as Edward Carrington arrived at Eleanor Whitaker's small flat. She had finally been offered permanent housing through a local council program, and Edward had insisted on helping her move. It was an uncharacteristic gesture for a man who had once prided himself on keeping personal matters at arm's length, but Eleanor's presence in his life had begun to change him in ways he was only starting to understand. Eleanor greeted him at the door, her face lighting up with a warm smile. "Edward, you didn't have to come." "I wanted to," he replied simply, stepping inside. The flat was modest but inviting, filled with the faint scent of lavender and lined with boxes ready for unpacking. "Tea first," Eleanor declared, motioning for him to sit at the small kitchen table. "Then we'll tackle the boxes." Edward chuckled softly, a rare sound that caught even him by surprise. "All right. Tea first." As they worked side by side to unpack Eleanor's belongings, their conversations flowed easily. Edward asked about the photographs she carefully placed on the shelves, snapshots of her younger years, her late sister Margaret, and the community events she had been involved in. Eleanor, in turn, asked Edward about his work, his travels, and his childhood memories with Sarah and Philip. When they came across a small wooden box filled with Eleanor's keepsakes, she hesitated. Inside were items she had held onto for decades: Jacob's baby shoes, a lock of his hair, and the letters she had written to him over the years but never sent. Eleanor held up the shoes, her eyes glistening. "You wore these on your first birthday," she said softly. "I couldn't bring myself to throw them away." Edward took the tiny shoes in his hands, a lump forming in his throat. The weight of her love and the sacrifices she had made felt almost unbearable. "You kept all of this," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Of course I did," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "You've always been my son, Edward. No matter how far apart we were, no matter how much time passed." Edward set the shoes down carefully, his hands trembling. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his vulnerability laid bare. I've spent so long keeping people at a distance. I don't know how to let you in. Eleanor reached across the table, placing her hand over his. You're doing it now, she said gently. One step at a time. Over the next few weeks, Edward and Eleanor's bond continued to grow. Edward began spending more time at the community center, helping Eleanor with her charity work. He was initially hesitant, unsure of how his polished, business-oriented demeanor would fit into the warm, chaotic environment. But as he worked alongside Eleanor and the other volunteers, he found a sense of fulfillment that had eluded him for years. One afternoon, as they prepared food parcels for families in need, Eleanor watched Edward with quiet pride. He had come so far from the cold, distant man who had once evicted her without a second thought. Now he was the one organizing donations, liaising with suppliers, and even chatting with the children who ran through the center with boundless energy. You're a natural, Eleanor said as they packed boxes together. Edward raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. I wouldn't go that far. Eleanor laughed. Well, I would. You've made a real difference here, Edward. And not just for me, for everyone. Edward glanced at her, his expression softening. I think you've made more of a difference for me than I have for anyone else. The turning point came when Eleanor suggested they collaborate on a larger project, a family support center that would provide housing, childcare, and career training for those in need. Edward was initially skeptical, wary of taking on such a significant commitment, but Eleanor's passion was infectious. Think of what we could do, she said, her eyes alight with hope. Together we could create something lasting. Something that gives people the opportunities we never had. Edward stared at her for a long moment, her words stirring something deep within him. For so long he had measured his success by the size of his portfolio and the number of deals he closed. But now he saw the possibility of a legacy that meant more than money. All right, he said finally, his voice steady. Let's do it. Over the next few months, Edward and Eleanor threw themselves into the project. Edward used his business acumen to secure funding and partnerships, while Eleanor worked tirelessly to ensure the center's programs were rooted in empathy and community needs. Their combined efforts began to attract attention, and soon, the support center became a symbol of hope for struggling families across London. As the opening day approached, Edward found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed. He no longer saw Eleanor as a painful reminder of his past. Instead, he saw her as a partner, a guide, and, most importantly, his mother. The day before the opening, Edward and Eleanor stood in the nearly finished center, admiring the bright, welcoming space they had created. The walls were painted in warm colors, the rooms filled with books, toys, and supplies for the families who would soon arrive. We did it, Eleanor said, her voice filled with wonder. We really did it. Edward looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you. Eleanor smiled, her eyes shining with tears. You've always had it in you, Edward. You just needed a reason to believe it. Edward pulled her into a gentle hug, the gesture awkward but genuine. For the first time, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known since his childhood, a sense of belonging he had thought was lost forever. As they stood together in the quiet of the new center, Edward realized that their journey wasn't just about healing the past. It was about building a future rooted in love, forgiveness, and hope. The grand opening of the Whitaker Carrington Family Support Center dawned with clear skies and a crisp, invigorating breeze. The building stood as a testament to resilience and collaboration, its warm, inviting design reflecting the values of the community it was built to serve. Banners fluttered in the wind, and a crowd began to gather, eager to witness the unveiling of a project that had already garnered widespread admiration. Edward Carrington adjusted his tie nervously as he stood behind the podium on the outdoor stage. Public speaking had never faced him before, but this was different. This wasn't just another business deal or ribbon-cutting ceremony, this was personal. Beside him, Eleanor Whitaker radiated quiet pride. She wore a simple dress with a scarf tied neatly around her neck, her silver hair catching the sunlight. She reached out, giving Edward's arm a reassuring squeeze. You'll do wonderfully, she said softly. Edward nodded, his expression still serious. I'm not worried about the speech. I'm worried about living up to it. Eleanor smiled. You already have. As the event began, the Mayor of London stepped forward to introduce the project. She spoke about the critical role the support center would play in the community, praising Edward and Eleanor for their vision and dedication. Then, with a flourish, she invited Edward to the podium. Edward cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the crowd. He saw journalists with cameras poised, families with curious children, and local leaders eager to show their support. but his gaze lingered on Eleanor, her presence grounding him. "When we started this project," Edward began, his voice steady, "I thought I was doing something noble, something to give back to the community. But the truth is, this center has given far more to me than I could ever give to it." The audience listened intently as Edward continued, his words carrying a weight that was new even to him. He spoke about his childhood, his adoptive parents, and the lessons they had taught him about kindness and perseverance. He talked about meeting Eleanor and the journey they had taken together, a journey that had changed him in ways he was still discovering. "For a long time," Edward said, his voice softening, "I believed that strength came from standing alone, from building walls to protect yourself. But I was wrong. Strength comes from connection, from allowing others into your life and trusting them to stand with you." He glanced at Eleanor, his eyes filled with gratitude. "This center isn't just a building. It's a symbol of what's possible when we choose compassion over indifference, love over resentment, and hope over despair." The audience erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the courtyard. Edward stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding as Eleanor joined him to cut the ribbon. Together, they held the oversized scissors, their hands briefly touching as they shared a quiet, triumphant smile. The first families entered the center shortly after the ceremony, exploring the brightly lit rooms and meeting the staff who would guide them through the programs. There were quiet tears from parents who had struggled for years to make ends meet, and laughter from children who discovered new toys and books waiting for them. Eleanor moved through the crowd, greeting everyone with warmth and sincerity. She knelt beside a young boy who was shyly clinging to his mother's leg and handed him a small stuffed bear. "Every great adventure needs a companion," she said with a wink. The boy grinned, clutching the bear tightly. Edward watched from across the room, his chest tightening with an unfamiliar emotion. He had spent so much of his life focused on material success, on building an empire that could withstand any storm. But here, in this simple, joyful moment, he saw a kind of wealth that couldn't be measured in bank statements or property portfolios. As the day wound down, Edward and Eleanor found themselves alone in the center's main hall. The sunlight streaming through the windows cast a golden glow, making the space feel almost sacred. "We did it," Eleanor said, her voice filled with quiet wonder. "I still can't believe it's real." Edward leaned against a nearby table, his tie loosened and his expression thoughtful. "It's real, all right. And it's because of you." Eleanor shook her head. "It's because of us, Edward. Together we made this happen." He looked at her, the weight of her words settling over him. "I spent so long blaming you," he admitted. "I let anger and bitterness define how I saw you, and how I saw myself. But now I see things differently. I see you differently." Eleanor's eyes glistened with tears, but she smiled. "And what do you see now?" Edward stepped closer, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I see my mother. The one who loved me enough to let me go, and the one who fought to find me again. And I'm grateful for all of it." Eleanor reached up, cupping his face with a trembling hand. "Oh, Edward," she whispered. "You've made me prouder than I ever thought possible." For the first time, Edward allowed himself to fully embrace the truth of their bond. He wrapped his arms around Eleanor, holding her tightly as the emotions he had suppressed for so long finally broke free. It wasn't just a hug, it was a promise, a reconciliation, and a beginning all at once. That night, as they left the center together, Eleanor slipped her arm through Edward's. They walked in comfortable silence, the city lights casting long shadows on the pavement. For the first time in years, Edward felt a sense of peace, a peace that came not from control or success, but from connection and love. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew they would face it together. And for Edward, that was more than enough. The Whitaker Carrington Family Support Center quickly became a beacon of hope in London. Families from all walks of life came through its doors, seeking assistance, education, and a sense of belonging. The impact was immediate and profound, touching lives in ways both Edward Carrington and Eleanor Whitaker had only dreamed of. But for Edward, the transformation was just beginning. Months after the opening, Edward sat in the center's office, poring over reports with Eleanor. She had taken on the role of day-to-day coordinator, working tirelessly to ensure the center met the needs of its growing community. Edward, still juggling his responsibilities in the business world, had committed to being involved at every level. "You're doing too much," Edward said as Eleanor rubbed her temples over a particularly dense spreadsheet. "We have staff for this." Eleanor chuckled softly. "And yet here you are doing the exact same thing." Edward leaned back, a rare smile crossing his face. "Point taken. But I mean it, you've already given so much. Let me take on more." Eleanor looked at him, her expression filled with gratitude. "You've already given me more than I could ever ask for, Edward." "No," Edward said, his tone earnest. "This isn't about giving back to you. It's about being the kind of person I should have been all along." The center wasn't just about helping others, it was about healing. For Edward, it was a space where he could confront his own fears and insecurities, where he could begin to repair the damage done by years of emotional isolation. For Eleanor, it was a place where she could channel her decades of longing into tangible, meaningful change. One afternoon, as they were preparing for a workshop on financial literacy, Edward noticed a young boy sitting alone in the playroom. The boy, no older than 8, was fiddling with a toy train, his expression distant. Edward approached cautiously. "That's a fine train you've got there," he said. The boy looked up, startled but relaxed when he saw Edward's kind smile. "It's missing a wheel," the boy mumbled. "I was trying to fix it." Edward crouched beside him. "I think I can help with that," he said, taking the train and examining it closely. With a few deft adjustments, he reattached the wheel and handed it back. "Good as new." The boy's face lit up as he tested the train on the floor. "Thanks, mister." Edward watched him play, a strange sense of satisfaction blooming in his chest. For a moment, he thought of the wooden train Eleanor had kept all those years, the one inscribed with the words to Jacob, "My sunshine." As the weeks turned into months, Edward and Eleanor's bond deepened. They shared dinners, revisited Eleanor's old neighborhood, and even took a weekend trip to the seaside, a place Eleanor had always dreamed of visiting but never had the chance. Each moment felt like a gift, a chance to reclaim the time they had lost. But the journey wasn't without its challenges. Edward still struggled with moments of doubt, moments where the scars of his past threatened to overshadow the progress he had made. In those moments, it was Eleanor's steady presence that guided him back. "You don't have to be perfect, Edward," she told him one evening as they sat on a park bench. "You just have to be present. That's enough." The center's first anniversary was celebrated with a community festival, complete with food stalls, music, and games for children. Edward and Eleanor stood on the main stage, addressing a crowd that had come to see them not as distant benefactors, but as part of their extended family. Edward spoke about the lessons he had learned over the past year, about humility, compassion, and the power of human connection. Eleanor followed, her voice filled with warmth as she thanked the community for embracing their shared vision. As the event wound down, Edward and Eleanor found themselves alone in the center's garden, the hum of laughter and conversation fading into the background. They sat together on a wooden bench, the evening sky painted in hues of orange and pink. "You've changed, you know," Eleanor said, her voice soft. "And not just for me, for yourself." Edward nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I never thought I'd feel this content. I spent so much of my life chasing things I thought would make me happy. But it was never about the things, it was about the people." Eleanor smiled, reaching for his hand. "You found your way, Edward. And I'm so proud of you." He turned to her, his eyes filled with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their journey settling over them. It hadn't been easy, and it never would be perfect, but they had found something far more valuable than perfection. They had found each other. What do you think about Edward's transformation? Do you believe his redemption was complete, or do you think there's more to explore in his journey? If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more moving narratives. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below.